Hello, and welcome to this installment of the Future Grind podcast. I'm your host, Ryan O'Shea. You may have noticed that there's been a longer than usual gap since our last episode, and that is because I was in Paris to speak at the VivoTech conference. But now I'm back with an interview with Amal Graafstra. Amal was one of the early pioneers of RFID implants in the mid-2000s, and he created the first implantable NFC tag, the XNT, in 2013. He sells these implants through his website, Dangerous Things, and his new company, VivoKey Technologies, promises to implant a cryptographically secure digital identity authentication and payment solution. Amal recently caused a stir when he created an implant-activated smart gun, which would only fire when held by an approved user. We discuss concerns of security and privacy, the FDA and other regulations, safety, and more. As always, show notes and more are available at futuregrind.org. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, and wherever podcasts are found. A video version of this episode is posted on Facebook and YouTube. Make sure to subscribe on all of these platforms, leave a review, and you can also like, comment, and share to spread the word. This is Future Grind. You may have noticed that was not the typical Future Grind intro music, and that is because this episode is being sponsored by our friends at Kunstwerk Multimedia. Kunstwerk is an immersive science fiction project from R. Nicholas Starr that explores a cyberpunk future through music, visual, and industrial arts. The project features distinct soundtracks telling the story of 4 different characters, featuring everything from the sounds of medieval Europe to science fiction-inspired electronic dance music. You can find this track or others in the show notes at futuregrind.org, or find out more about the synthesis of the arts at kunstwerkmultimedia.com. If you'd like to support this podcast with a donation or find out more about sponsorship opportunities, you can visit futuregrind.org/support. And now, Amal Graafstra. All right, and now we're here with Amal. Amal, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, no problem.
So you are best known for your work as a pioneer in the field of implanted technology. And in 2006, you released your book, RFID Toys, which focused on do-it-yourself projects using RFID technology. But only a few pages of this over 300-page book actually talk about implants. How did this interest in RFID come about, and how did it ultimately lead to experiments with implanted technology?
Well, actually, I started experimenting with the implant side before the RFID side, or at the same time, really. It all came from a real serious drive for getting rid of my keys. And so, if you think about the things that you carry with you on a daily basis, keys, wallet, and phone, they're like little burdens, right? They're like your modern day Tamagotchi. And if you don't constantly manage them, you could be locked out of places. And so I was essentially working out of an office that was in a basement of a building, and I had one door that was an emergency exit, and I couldn't leave it unlocked. It was not possible to unlock the door. So every time I'd step out, if I didn't have my keys, I'd be locked out, and it happened a lot. And when I'm working IT, you work after hours quite a bit. So when it happened after hours, I would have to call up a facilities guy, and he'd have to drive in very angry and open the door for me. So that happened a few times, and I was like, no, this has to change. There has to be a way for the door to just know that it's me. And, so I looked at fingerprint scanners and iris scanners, biometric systems, and, this was 2005. So they were quite clunky and expensive and not well suited for outdoors. And even though today they've gotten cheaper, they are still not very well suited for outdoor applications. There's other issues. But at the time I wanted something that was robust and cheap and reliable. And the, RFID access cards, the thing you just kind of swipe at the door and it beeps and you get in, that was the ideal solution for me, except I didn't want to have to trade a metal key for a plastic card. That didn't really solve my problem. So I started thinking about all these different RFID solutions, and one of them was pets. Pets have been getting these implants for a long time, and they're an RFID form of RFID technology. So I thought, well, why not me, right? So I called around companies that made these chips for animals, and quickly realized there were some downsides to the animal chip. First, it was proprietary data protocols, which meant you had to buy these expensive vet readers and try to hack them. And the other thing was they had this coating on them that was meant for tissue to grow into it to lock the chip in place, which is very necessary for an animal, but not ideal for a human. So eventually found a company that was making these chips with different types of silicon inside. And so they had different data protocols and different capabilities. And I found one that was very common, what's called EM chip. And I was like, ooh, send me some samples of that. So talked to the engineer. They confirmed it's the same materials used in the pet implants, all the safe glass and epoxy resins and everything. So they sent me some samples. And while they were in transit, I built an access control system for the door and then talked to my doctor about putting it in. And so they arrived and we looked at it, put it in the autoclave, and he put it in my left hand. So it was kind of like, an interest in RFID as a solution to a problem, necessity is a mother of invention kind of thing.
I've had Kevin Warwick as a previous guest on this podcast who did a lot of research with RFID implants in the 1990s and actually had one implanted in his arm at that point. Were you aware of the work that he had done in this field when you had the idea to do this?
Yeah, I mean, in researching the pet stuff, I had also come across his work, and I was like, oh, okay, so this isn't unheard of. He did it in '98, and it was, I think, a 2-week long period. And the thing that he had was quite large. It was in his forearm, and so that was great for that application. Getting a huge hunk of glass encased thing in my arm, it was not something that I wanted to have permanently. So I looked for a much smaller solution, looked for something that could be essentially off the shelf, and came across this company. And also I came across another company that in 2004 had received FDA approval for human use transponder implants, so VeriChip. But they were putting the biobond coating on their chips, so the thing that your tissue grows into, which I didn't want. And then they were injecting it deep into the tricep muscle, and that created all kinds of other usability issues. Like I can't put my tricep muscle up to the door, right, to unlock it. It's not user friendly, and I also want to be able to remove or replace the chip easily if I chose to. And digging it out of a tricep muscle is not easy to do. So we worked with a doctor to say, where's the best placement? It should be in the hand so I can manipulate the position easily. We should make it subdermal, just in the fascia tissue, so that it's easily removable or replaceable, but still secure. And we basically come up with the area between the first and second metacarpal of the hand, in that little triangle squishy area between thumb and index finger. That's kind of like the ideal spot because there's no major nerve bundles. They run around that area. Major blood vessels nothing's really going through there. So, and it's also squishy. It's a lot of cushion for what you're putting in there. So we put it right there in that section of the hand, and I was immediately able to start using it.
Your website, Dangerous Things, sells RFID implants, scalpels, pain management kits, and other tools. First of all, what's the story behind the name Dangerous Things, and what led you to start your own company?
Well, I first did the implant in the hand and left hand in 2005, and since then I wrote the book and everything. And there was really kind of an interest, but it was more of a passing interest. I would get emails occasionally from people who wanted to kind of do the same thing or whatever. But around 2009, 10, the maker revolution really started to get underway. Hobbyists started making electronics again, and it became a very popular thing. And then there were RFID readers that started to become available for very cheap. You could plug into these Arduino systems or any kind of open source hardware, hobbyist development type of platforms. So there's a lot of interest starting to be generated about RFID transponders and particularly implants. And it got to the point where the internet being what it is, tracking something down to the source is quite difficult sometimes. So you just started to see this explosion of YouTube videos and other things of people just like taking transponders out of like car keys, like things that are definitely not safe for implantation, toxic epoxy resins inside, glass that's, lead doped, or it's not really safe for human implantation use. So this was kind of terrifying to me. And at the same time, I started getting this deluge of email. And so I just decided like, I have to do something where I can, like take time doing this because I think it's interesting and I want to continue working in the space of like implantable electronics, and it's very interesting to me. So at one point I remember sitting there, I'm like, should I just like stop doing consulting, IT consulting, and just start doing this? And so decided to go ahead and make a business model around it. And so the first thing that I did was I just made a store like store.aml.net or something like that, and just kind of played around with the idea. And then I talked to somebody about it, and they said, "Oh, are you really going to sell these dangerous things on your on your website? It seems like not a good idea." And I was like, "Oh my God, that's amazing. I'm going to call it dangerous things." It was just like a tongue-in-cheek kind of joke about what it is, because the whole point of starting it was two goals. One was to ensure the things that we sold were safe, like we tested them and batch test the lots and everything, and select the right factories and get the materials ourselves, all that stuff. And then two was that people that buy the stuff have a safe method of installation. So, we did that by partnering with doctors and professional body piercers. But the name itself was really just kind of a tongue-in-cheek homage to all the grandmas out there being like, "Oh my God, this is so dangerous," when it really isn't. I think I bought the domain for like $2,000 from a guy, and then threw the store on there, and then it just kind of evolved from that point.
In 2013, you turned to the crowdfunding platform Indiegogo to fund the creation of the XNT, which you described as the world's first NFC-compliant RFID implant. Your goal was $8,000, but you blew by that, ultimately bringing in nearly 4 times that with over $30,000. How did you decide to move beyond working with off-the-shelf technology and design and manufacture your own? And were there any roadblocks in that process that you had to overcome?
Well, I saw the utility of the things that we were sourcing, but they were, economies of scale, and manufacturers are using them for usually implanting into hardware, so devices, things like that. But we went through, I think originally we sourced from 25 different factories, and only a few of them actually had safe materials, and they were selling them as like animal implants. It was just it was shocking to me that that something that a factory in China was selling for use as a animal implantable RFID transponder, presumably for pets, maybe for livestock. I don't know what their target markets are, but the glass would contain aluminum or lead, or the epoxy resin would like kill off cell line cultures, and it was just shocking. So we did find some factories, but ultimately nobody was making anything in the high frequency spectrum. So everything was low frequency, so 125 kilohertz or 134 kilohertz, which was typically an animal ID, ISO standard, or just a proprietary animal ID protocols. So all NFC tags are high frequency, 1356 megahertz, and they are specific chips that conform to a particular NFC forum compliance requirement. So these were not off the shelf devices, and so I started. First, I decided, well, rather than buying off the shelf for these materials, I need to go to the suppliers. So I would get our own glass, get our own epoxy resin, get our own antennas made, all this stuff, so that we can control quality of those materials. Then, we used one of the factories that was producing the other off the shelf component, and said, hey, we need to make these new things, and they had a lot of reservations. They're like, it's not going to work, it's a terrible idea, and I'm like, just do it. Just like, the calculations we have show that it'll work, so like, just let's make some prototypes. And that all went fine, except there were two things that I had to do. One is, there's a real difficulty when you're making anything that is low quantity. So I'm not making a million of these things, right? I made a few thousand, and that was the original idea for the campaign. But when you're dealing with industry that normally they'll sell a wafer full of these silicon dies, and the wafer has 300,000 chips in it, right? And so then you have to buy an entire wafer, right? That's not possible. It's not possible for a project like this. So what I had to do was I had to work with a logistics company in China to be able to essentially break up those orders. So they would find other customers that wanted to buy maybe 10,000 chips or 100,000 chips, so not a whole wafer full. And then we would all jump on that order wafer, and then split it up amongst ourselves. And so, being able to work with these lower quantity volumes in an industry that's normally dealing with millions of parts per order, that's a challenge. And so what actually ended up happening was that company that was helping me do the logistics for all this, after the Indiegogo campaign, they put their own version online. And then China being what it is, a ton of other manufacturers were like, oh, this is something new, cool, we'll essentially knock it off and make our own. But again, when I went back to start testing some of the stuff, they will use whatever is available and cheap and swap it out. If you're not supplying a factory directly your own materials, then they will substitute whatever they can get their hands on, right? So if it's cheaper epoxy that's not safe or it's toxic, or glass that's industrial grade with contaminants in it, they're like, yeah, well, it's cheaper and it looks the same, so throw it in there. And you have to test for that. You have to do a lot of hard work, and it's very difficult to buy off the shelf and think that it's going to be safe. Even if you test a few lots out of the batch, right? It's still not possible because they could switch materials midway through the production run. So, I've seen these other kind of vendors pop up, and the prices that they have and the methods they're using, I'm sure that they're just buying something off the shelf now from one of the many manufacturers that are putting, NFC glass tube transponders online. And I'm just terrified that that's going to result in something bad happening. But the challenge, of course, is like, how do you convince a vendor that's supplying glass, for example? You have to say, hey, I'm not going to buy a pallet full of this. I need, a box of it. And my estimated annual quantities are going to be, in the thousands, not millions. And so you have to find champions within all of these materials vendors that understand what you're doing and why and want to support you. That's the biggest challenge.
You mentioned that in 2004, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved the VeriChip for human implantation as a Class 2 medical device, specifically to be used for enabling doctors to access medical records. Was the 510K clearance for equivalent devices applicable to your XNT tags, or was the FDA clearance not relevant in your case because they weren't being used in a medical application?
Both. So it was totally applicable. We could have filed a 510K, had gotten pre-market approval for the XNT, but the problem comes with regulations for our partners, which are by and large professional body piercers. So a piercer, is the perfect partner for installing these transponders because they are pretty much everywhere. They work out of licensed and bonded studios for the most part. They are well versed in aseptic procedure and needles and skin, and they know how to make it work, right? And so unlike a doctor who you have to convince and might not understand why a person would want to do such a thing, for a body piercer, like, yeah, that's cool. Like, it's just another kind of form of fancy body jewelry in their opinion for the most part. So by getting the FDA approval for it, though, it converts that device, regardless of whether or not you want to use it as such, but it converts that device to a medical device. And a lot of jurisdictions and regulations in those geographic areas put limits on what a body piercer can use as part of their craft. And almost across the board, it prohibits use of any medical devices. They don't want body piercers playing doctor. And so, they can't use scalpels, for example, and a lot of places they can't use dermal punches because that's like a biopsy punch. So we avoided getting FDA approval for such a device, even though it was totally possible. But in the future, I think we're going to release products through a different company called VivoKey that's going to definitely be exploring the 510K form and also medical applications potentially.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to want to talk a lot about VivoKey here in a bit. But first, when the FDA approved the VeriChip, one of the risk factors they listed was possible MRI incompatibility. In response to this, VeriChip said they commissioned the University of Minnesota to conduct a study that declared VeriChip to be MRI compatible. Have you done similar testing, and what have the experiences of people with chip implants been when an MRI is ordered?
So we did not have the full clinical trial done. We used the data from their trial, and then we did follow on. What's the word? It's essentially just confirms the data is accurate. So we did some testing with 1 Tesla, 3 Tesla, and we were able to get into a 7 Tesla machine. So essentially, we claim that the chip is MRI compatible up to 7 Tesla. Beyond that, we don't know. I don't think it's going to be an issue, but there are lab MRIs that go up to 13 Tesla, so extremely strong. I don't think anybody's going to be, in a medical context, is going to be entering a lab grade 13 Tesla MRI machine, but it is what it is. So I do know that there are magnetic flux issues with the ferrite coil in the transponder itself, only because we placed one on top of a magnetic flux disk launcher, which is essentially a giant electromagnet pulse. If you ever took an old hard drive apart, there's like metal disks inside that spin. And so if you place one of those discs on this launcher, a bunch of capacitors charge up, and then he hits the button, and the magnetic lines of flux like create a massive eddy current in that steel disc, and then it essentially pushes itself off the platform, and it will launch like 30 feet in the air. And so we were curious, and we put an XNT on it, and then put a cup over it just to contain it if it did move. And so he charged it up and hit the go button, and it did jump inside the cup. It kind of jumped up and slammed around a little bit, not super violently, but it did move, obviously. So it is possible to affect it with magnetic flux lines. But for the most part, the theory is that when it's an MRI machine, you have this oscillating field that essentially creates eddy currents in the ferrite coil rod that the antenna is wrapped around. And those eddy currents, by and large, cancel the oscillating field. So it doesn't move. It doesn't really generate much heat. It's just, for the most part, invisible to the MRI.
When the subject of implanted technology comes up, security and privacy are major concerns for a lot of people, and rightly so. In 2010, Dr. Mark Gasson of the University of Reading demonstrated the ability to pass computer viruses between his implanted RFID tag and the database that stores that information. The virus was then passed along to any other RFID tag, implanted or otherwise, that was scanned by that infected database. In other examples, people have cloned or spoofed RFID tags, which is essentially the RFID equivalent of duplicating a key. The fact that RFID and NFC chips could only communicate when in close proximity used to be a major security feature, but now there have been demonstrated relay hacks in which, for example, thieves could be able to relay the information from a key fob to a car more than 1,000 feet away, enabling it to be stolen. What are your thoughts on these security issues, and how can we handle this?
Yeah, so I know Mark pretty well, and it was a really great thing that he showed. And his motivation behind that project was actually to highlight the security issues in medical implant devices like deep brain stimulators, pacemakers, insulin pumps. He didn't really care too much about the transponders, but it was a great segue for him to start raising conversation about those security issues. And that was back when people weren't really thinking too much about that, and doctors and device manufacturers weren't really all that serious about medical device security. And these are devices that can kill you if they're hacked, right? Like they can shock your brain to oblivion, they can like stop your heart, and they can pump insulin into you until you die. Like it's very serious. And so, he did this project to raise awareness about that. But the project itself, it did work technically. Yes, you could transfer a virus to an implanted transponder and then onto other systems. But that was a Rube Goldberg device of setting up the entire system to fail. It was a series of engineered vulnerabilities that I think would be extremely difficult to find in the wild for the most part. But it was a great proof of concept. If we want to move on to like actually doing relay attacks or cloning or emulating chips, most RFID and even NFC tags in particular, they are essentially meant to be read. Security was not ever really a concern because the idea was that they were meant to be read by the public. So you would have a smart poster application, for example, where you'd walk up to a movie poster and tap your phone, read the data, go to the website, see the trailer on the YouTube or whatever. So security was never meant to be part of the design process for those types of tags. Other RFID tags like access cards, things like that, they definitely have a security bent, but again, they were not designed very well. And so the idea was, again, security through obscurity. Nobody's going to know how to read these cards or emulate them, or it's way too much trouble. Nobody's going to bother. And that just has been proven to be not the case, particularly for commercial use cases. So when this came up for dangerous things about the XEM and XNT and that kind of thing, I said, yeah, that does exist. Somebody could walk up to you, read your tag, get the ID, emulate it, and get into your house, for example. But the context is completely different. You're not a bank. You're not a commercial target. It's your house specifically. So the difference being that in a commercial context, anybody could just walk up to an employee exiting a building. If an attacker wants to get into that building, you could target almost any employee leaving. It doesn't matter. It's basically a random attack. You scan their badge, and now you can get into that building. So the target is the building, not the person. Whereas with an implant and a personal use context, like your house door or logging into your specific computer, that attack is very personal and targeted to you, not necessarily your house. Like if some random person wants to break into your house, they don't really know you. They just want to get into your house. They're going to break a window, right? But it's a very, very slim cross section of potential attackers that would know who you are, know that you have an implant, scan your implant, emulate it to get into your specific house and log into your specific computer. It's a very targeted personal attack that is extremely unlikely. And so, that was the argument. It was like, well, yes, it is a potential risk for these products, but it's extremely unlikely. And as long as you understand that, that's fine. But the problem with that, the problem ultimately is that the utility needs to expand beyond personal use devices. Like it needs to expand beyond your specific house, right, and your specific car or door or whatever. So that's again where all the products that we're developing for VivoKey are going to be cryptographically secured. So completely different. They will actually use cryptograms and do in vivo encryption. So it's not just storing encrypted data on the tag. It's actually the tag is performing encryption inside your body, and those keys to do that are never actually forfeit. So they're not sent to a third party. They're not scanned out of the tag. The encryption is actually done in vivo.
Yeah, let's move on to VivoKey now, and a little bit of background on this. In 2016, you announced the UKey project, which you described as a platform for digital identity, authentication, cryptography, and payment applications secured with an implantable subdermal NFC device. The UKey project has now grown into an entirely new company known as VivoKey Technologies, and I'd love to find out why this is so important. You mentioned some of the uses of it there, but what makes VivoKey so much better than traditional keys, passwords, or even conventional two-factor authentication?
Sure. So it was probably around the same time, around 2015 maybe, where I was sitting in a cafe in Amsterdam actually, and I was thinking about dangerous things and what we were doing. And I was just like trying to envision where are we going with this? What's the future? And I hit on the fact that for me, replacing my keys was great because I got rid of 1/3 of that management burden. Out of the keys, wallet, and phone scenario, I was able to get rid of the keys, which is 1/3 of the things you have to manage all day. And for me, the keys were really the bane of my existence. They were the most difficult to manage. They were lumpy. They were just this collection of physical metal keys. It was just terrible in every way. So I was happy with that, but it wasn't really a problem that was being solved in mass. So like, what's the problem for human society? That was the I wanted to elevate my vision of what we could do in the future to solve a real problem for people, and not just some simple key replacement. So that's where I started to think about all the keys on your keychain and all the cards in your wallet and all the usernames and passwords you have. These are all identity tokens that represent you to some system as an authorized user to be able to make a payment, or an authorized user to go through this specific door, or an authorized user to go, log into this computer or website. And it was then that I realized that we are a walking collection of identity tokens. So it's almost as if all these tokens representing us are more important than the physical being that we are. And so, like, an example would be, if I walk into a bank, I can't set up an account just being me physically in my body. I need to carry all this extra identity information with me. And that identity information is ultimately way more important than the physical me. Like, I could probably set up a bank account without being there present physically in person, but as long as I had all these other identity tokens that represent me, because they are more important to modern society than me. So I thought, well, out of all the advantages to using an implantable identity device, there's also the other advantage that unlike tools that you pick up and carry with you and have to manage, having it a well-designed in vivo device, meaning it's frictionless, it's managementless, it just does its job and you kind of almost forget it's even there, that, for all intents and purposes, becomes part of who you are. And so, again, it rips back the importance from all these tokens floating around out there to the important part being me. And by augmenting the human body with the capability of performing encryption, I can now verify my own identity, whether or not it's physical in the real world or digital online or a mix of both. So that's where the idea for the VivoKey, or at the time YuKey, came from. It was like trying to solve the identity problem in a way that makes it secure, like a cryptographic token, convenient, like a biometric, and part of who I am. It brings the importance back to me, not all my collection of tokens. And so that project evolved from YuKey being this device that we were working on to VivoKey Technologies, because again, I realized that it's more than just that device. There needs to be a strategic integration with different services to be able to make it work and be more useful for everyone. So to solve the identity problem, I need to be able to partner with Facebook, for example, so you can log into Facebook and verify your identity with scan of your VivoKey implant, right? I need to be able to allow my computer to log in with it and be able to support that both locally and also across the network and online. So the evolution into a company, which is now working on several different products, that the original YuKey evolved into what's now called the VivoKey Flex. We're also coming out with a VivoKey Mini, which is an injectable cryptographic token. And then we're going to have probably another product. It's further out, but we'll see. So at least 3 in the next, I would say, 24 months, and all of them cryptographically secure. So they all perform in vivo encryption. There won't be any issues or risk with somebody walking by, skimming your ID, cloning it, emulating it, relaying it, none of that.
And the VivoKey Flex isn't your standard glass tube encasement. It's flat and composed of a flexible biopolymer. First of all, why was this change necessary, and what engineering challenges did you face when designing this?
Well, the Flex, essentially, when you have a passive transponder device, you are essentially creating an air core transformer when you bring that device up to a reader. So the reader has an inductor, an antenna, but it's really just an inductor. It resonates at a specific frequency and sends out a magnetic field. Then you bring the tag, transponder, within range of that magnetic field. It also has an inductor antenna, and it will induct or pull power from the field and then modulate that field to communicate. There's no traditional electric field transmissions happening. It's not like a cell phone. It's not like Bluetooth, Wi-Fi. It's a magnetically coupled system. And so the performance of that system relies heavily on how well the reader antenna and the tag antenna shape the magnetic field that's being used to communicate and pass power and data. So the shapes and sizes and configurations and geometries of both of those antennas play a huge part in how well something will perform, how much power can be transferred, how fast the data can be moved across that field. So when you're dealing with a secure element, something like the VivoKey Flex, which is performing cryptography and doing all this heavy computing work, it needs more power than your traditional RFID tag, which is going to spit out an ID to anybody that asks. So that power requirement was the number one reason for changing the physical dimensions and geometry of the inductor antenna. And that required moving away from cylindrical wire-wound antennas inside of these glass tubes to a flat spiral plane antenna. And that's essentially because every antenna in a reader that you come across is going to be that flat spiral plane shape. And so it's going to create a magnetic field with lines of flux that will interact most efficiently with other tag antennas of the same spiral plane geometry. So we had to physically change the orientation and geometry of that antenna, and making it a flat design improved efficiency to the point where we got enough power to perform all the cryptography functions we needed. But then, of course, that won't fit into a glass tube. So we needed to figure out a way to properly encapsulate something. And the traditional model, I think, in both body modification and in the biohacker space, is to go to silicon. Or silicone rather. So you have a silicone elastomer, and you would, pour a bunch of it out and put your thing in there and pour a bunch more, and you'd end up with this traditionally very thick, rubbery device. And I never was one for waste, and so that all that thickness is necessary from a structural integrity standpoint for typical silicone-based, encapsulated device and devices, but we worked for, I would say, probably a little over a year, maybe 14 or so-ish months on different polymers and different application, methods and all that stuff. And we finally hit on our kind of our secret sauce. So at the moment, we are able to keep the entire thickness of the VivoKey Flex at zero point 0.4 millimeters, which makes it very flexible. And also, it's the material itself is robust. So we're able to produce something that's extremely thin. It requires minimal effort to be able to install it. And yeah, it's just ideal from perspective of intended design.
You mentioned a bit earlier how you plan to take the VivoKey Flex through the FDA approval process. Why are you deciding to do that with this as opposed to the XNT? What is different about the VivoKey?
Well, actually, we're probably not going to take the VivoKey Flex through FDA approval, but we will be taking the VivoKey Mini through approval. And the reason for the difference is that the VivoKey Mini is able to undergo a 510(k) form filing because it's similar to the device that VeriChip had approved. The Flex is fundamentally different in terms of materials, shape, size, all that stuff. So that's going to take a much more difficult clinical trial process. And at the moment, we're not planning on doing that simply because the number of people interested in getting a Flex is going to be fundamentally lower than people interested in getting the Mini, simply because of the installation procedure. So yeah, at the moment, it's just the Mini. But the reason that we're going for that is that it's twofold. One, Dangerous Things is a great marketing channel for biohackers, right? Biohackers are bleeding edge. They want to push the envelope. They don't mind a name like Dangerous Things, all those things. Biohackers think the name Dangerous Things is cool. I do too. But the idea that the general customer from mass market type customer is going to go to a company called Dangerous Things and want to buy an implant, it's not happening. And so the type of customer that's been coming to Dangerous Things and buying products has been changing for the last, I'd say, 18 months or so. The initial customers were very technically oriented. They were asking for data sheets. They were wanting to know about the protocols. And the customers coming now, there still are technical customers, but the customers coming now are asking, what can I do with it? They don't really understand the technology behind it. They just want to get in the car and drive. And so, it takes a special kind of customer to straddle both worlds of wanting to, not really understanding the technology, but thinking it's cool, wanting to get involved, wanting to get an implant and try it out, but also doesn't mind that they're buying it from a company called Dangerous Things. So the whole idea of making VivoKey technologies, we're approaching the market from the other spectrum. Everything's going to be consumer, oriented, so mass market oriented. The name is it makes sense. It's a VivoKey, like it's in your body. It's the key to life, that kind of thing. We're getting FDA approval so we can show, hey, look, we've taken this thing. We took it to FDA. We showed them it's similar to this. We did these tests. It's good. They give it a thumbs up. All of the approach is for that mass market customer to make the idea of human augmentation through implanting and be able to improve your security all just like not a biohack, but just a normal thing.
And VivoKey recently participated in the Rebel Bio Startup Accelerator program in London, meaning that Rebel Bio invested in the company and offered mentorship and resources to help you bring the product to market. How did that arrangement come about, and what was that process like?
Yeah, so I was at the point where with VivoKey that I was like, we need to start reaching out to pre-seed investment rounds, and so we looked at some angel investors, and they were interested, but they also had questions about, are people going to do this? It doesn't seem, they kind of looked at the history with Dangerous Things. And they said, well, yeah, that's a bunch of crazy biohackers. What about the normal mass market? We don't think it's going to work. And so, we're kind of stuck in this position of having to kind of prove it. And so, I started applying to accelerators because accelerators have connections. So like if an accelerator says to an angel investor, well, we believe in it, and, they pass muster with our business side of things, then angel investors would be more interested in investing at that point. So I looked at all the accelerators that are possible: Y Combinator, Techstars, to IndieBio in San Francisco, and Rebel Bio. And it just turned out that we applied to Y Combinator, they turned us down, and then we applied to Rebel Bio, and at the time, Indiegogo and Techstars were both full for the year. So they'd already had their open call for applications, and they closed them, and that was it. So Rebel Bio was kind of like out of there were a few others that I applied to as well, but Rebel Bio was just happened to be at the right time. So they had just opened their thing, and applications were still coming in, so we sent it. And we went through a series of calls with them, and finally talked to the top guy there, and they said, okay, well, let's do this. We're in London, so are you going to come to London? And so I had to talk with the fam and say, let's pack up and head over there for 4 months and see what we can do. And it was definitely not easy to go, but definitely well worth it. It was a good experience overall. I learned a lot about how to maintain momentum. They don't call it an accelerator for nothing. And keeping people engaged, and really it's about maintaining that momentum. It's easy to sit back, particularly when you're doing your own, running your own business. You kind of choose the pace that works for you, and you need to choose the pace that works for your business. And that's probably the most important thing, to be honest, that I learned there is to keep that momentum going and keep accelerating. And it's been the biggest challenge actually after leaving the program.
Yeah, I've went the accelerator route before as well, and it's definitely basically a crash course into an MBA is how I would describe it, and the stakes are a lot higher because it's not just pass-fail, it's if you fail, your entire company tanks. So there's a lot more riding on it in those situations. In your XNT Indiegogo campaign, you said that you would continue developing more devices, software, and services, and that whenever possible, these projects would be open source. What is your strategy for building a successful company that can afford to innovate and manufacture while also recognizing the importance of open source?
That's always a tough balance. And the reality is that it affects your business model, I think, in a way that, for VivoKey, for example, we're publishing applications. The VivoKey Flex will run actual small Java card applets. Those Java card applets that we are putting on the platform are open source. Anybody can grab them, use them, modify them, publish their own, all that kind of stuff. So the key is to not center your revenue source around that element. So if somebody else wants to take one of the applets that we published and put their own up, that's fine. That shouldn't have a major impact to our bottom line. And if you are running a business where your main, your secret sauce is the thing that you're developing, and if somebody were to simply, clone your repo and put their own up, and now you're out, that's not a good business model. It's very tough to make it happen. But when it comes to open source, we are putting the things that are extremely relevant to people's concerns, particularly around security. So, how does that OTP applet actually work? How does it generate the codes? Is there any problem with the backdoors or something like that? They can review the code, they can compile it, they can check it against the published version, all that, and we can do all that without actually revealing the secret sauce of other elements of our business model, right?
So I've interviewed many of the most prominent figures in the human augmentation space, specifically those that work with bionics. Many of them, including Tim Cannon and Rich Lee, have indicated that it was discovering Left Anonym that introduced them to the world of biohacking. Now, I spoke to Left on this podcast, and Left says that it was your book, RFID Toys, that got it started experimenting with implants. So really, it seems like most of the recent advancement in this space can be traced back to you. But perhaps we can trace it back further than that. What is your background, and what got you introduced to and interested in experimenting with implants?
Well, my background is, high school educated, some college, dropped out of college to start an internet service company when it was, dial-up modems. And I don't even think the 56K modem was out then. It was like 33.6K modems at the time. And worked for Boeing for a bit and did a bunch of stuff. But essentially, I've just been a kind of jack of all trades type person for a long time, and spent a lot of time doing, IT work, consulting, or doing I was director of IT for a manufacturing company, doing alternative energy inverter manufacturing for a few years, and really just the whole, the whole idea of RFID implants really just came around in 2005 when I was like, I need to be able to get in this dang door reliably. Like, I don't want to have to manage these keys anymore. what technologies exist that would let me do that in the way that I want to do it. And yeah, that's where I just went online. I thought about the pet implants, went online, saw, Kevin Warwick had done it, VeriChip had gotten FDA approval. It's like, yeah, this is no brainer. Let's get this done.
Your work with implants is often considered biohacking, and I think this word has some issues. The term hacker has negative connotations for many people, for example. However, it seems that this is a term you've openly adopted. In fact, the title of your TEDx talk was Biohacking, the Forefront of a New Kind of Human Evolution, and the tagline of Dangerous Things is Custom Gadgetry for the Discerning Biohacker. What does biohacker mean to you?
Well, you're right. I mean, the term hack does have negative connotations, and what I like to focus on is the term hack itself having a meaning that is more positive, like a hack being simply an alternative solution or something that's unconventional, a way of approaching a problem in an unconventional manner. That makes it a hack, right? So, like my early days were, growing up on my grandparents' dairy farm. Dairy farmers are very hacker oriented. If something breaks, you fix it. If you don't have a solution, you make one. The welding torch and the tool bench were constantly in use. And so seeing this idea of hacking to other solutions for things either you couldn't afford or just didn't exist, that was commonplace. And so biohacking is simply applying those unconventional approaches and solution finding to the world of biology. And the term biohacking is, of course, a big umbrella. And underneath it, there are everything from, lifestyle hacking, which is anything from meditation to taking nootropics or trying new unconventional diets to, fiddling with DNA or RNA to what we're doing, which is implanting devices to augment our capabilities as human beings. So it's a big umbrella term, but I like to think of it as a term that's endearing.
I know that you've worked with two different doctors to perform your first two implant procedures, but for most people, this just isn't possible. Many doctors refuse to perform this type of work, so people who are interested in getting an implant are required to either go to a body modification artist or to attempt a do-it-yourself procedure. I personally do not recommend the latter method. However, your website sells scalpels, lidocaine, and more, which may seem to be some type of tacit endorsement of do-it-yourself procedures. What are your thoughts on getting implants? How should this part of the process happen?
I think that, our two goals initially were safe materials, safe devices, and safe procedures. And I would say for the first few months, we actually produced a DIY guide for installing transponders and put that up. And then, at the same time, we were trying to reach out to doctors about, performing installations by medical professionals and how to make that happen. And so, we ran into all these kind of objections from the medical industry at the time, and the objections were not medical or safety in nature. They were ethical, ethical objections. They didn't think that this was a valuable elective procedure. People didn't understand that, the doctors themselves, the medical professionals, registered nurses, et cetera, didn't understand the technology. The only education they'd ever received on a human chip implant was from Hollywood movies. And, we're constantly answering questions like, no, it doesn't track you. No, it doesn't, and the best thing we could say is it's just like a pet chip. You can scan it. But even there, pet chip marketers use the word tracking chip, but it's not. It's an identity device. You can't find a lost pet. You have to get the pet, bring it to a veterinarian or an animal shelter. They scan it at zero range with a scanner and get the ID number and then call up the person. It's not a tracking device. And so we were just getting this stonewall, and then that's what kind of prompted us to put the DIY guide online. But then we got some contacts from professional piercers that were like, hey, this isn't a good idea to let people do this themselves. And I said, yeah, I agree, but there's no alternative. Like, doctors are refusing. And so they're like, well, we can do it. And I was like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. Let's do it. So we immediately took down the guide and started building a partner network and started attending, professional piercing conferences, body mod conferences. And we did that for several years, just introducing the concept, who we are, what we're doing. No, the chips aren't tracking devices. No, we don't work with the government. All those kind of questions. And very quickly, we were able to sign on, hundreds of professional body piercers as partners. So, and now we use the customers themselves to go into local shops with a guide that says, here's all the information about the material, here's what we want you to do, and then try to get them to recruit new partners.
You also perform many implantations yourself. Did you receive any formal training to be able to do this? And are you concerned with any potential liability or legal ramifications from performing these procedures?
Well, I worked with the initial doctors quite a bit to determine the best location and why, and what are the potential risks and how do you avoid blood vessels, all that kind of stuff. So it wasn't a formal training, but it was pretty decent training. The other training that you should definitely have is bloodborne pathogen training, which is how to maintain a sterile field, be very aware of contamination, cross-contamination, all that kind of stuff. So I developed a procedure for essentially any partner, piercing partner, but also for myself to follow. And it's very, specific. And so, a regular professional piercer would probably be insulted by the level of specificity in the guide, because it's like, rudimentary stuff, stuff that they were like, I've done this before, but it's really, really clockwork. It's very important to understand each step and the reason why behind each step, for example. And so I'm very confident in being able to install them. I've done probably around 4,500 by now at various events and personal installations and things. And so all of that is fine. I haven't really had any issues. I had one person fully pass out once. That resolved in a matter of seconds. And then some other people kind of hit with nausea after, lay them down, get them water, tend to them, and that resolves quickly as well. So I did have one anemic who did not declare that they were anemic until after, and then it took, I think, a little over an hour for it to stop, bleeding. So I was very annoyed with them at that point, because I do ask, is there anything we should know about before proceeding? Are you sick? Do you have any medical conditions that would be an issue? And they were like, nope, let's go. and then an hour later, I'm still holding a bandage. So, but anyway, as far as liability goes, that's a tricky one, and we're presented with the idea that law is stone, right? It's written on stone. It's very rigid, but in reality, it's not. It's all interpreted, and generally, what people are looking for in a court scenario is intent or negligence or both. And so, gross negligence being like you just don't know what the hell you're doing, and you should have known that you don't know what the hell you're doing, and you know what I mean, and you just endanger people because you felt like it. So, it's a situation where, by the letter of the law, by me simply performing the installation without charging for it, I'm not making. I do every install is free. You can buy the product and then come to me as a friend and say, hey, could you jam this in my hand? And then, yeah, I'll do that. So, that scenario is very tough to prosecute because it's not a business, right? The second I say, give me $1 and I'll do it, then it becomes a business transaction, and you need to get a piercing license, you need to work out of a bonded studio, and all these things happen. But if it's just two private citizens doing a thing, it's a lot more, at the very least, gray area. But the other thing is that, I used to have a release form kind of thing. And I talked to lawyers and spent a lot of money going back and forth about that. And they essentially told me, well, it doesn't matter what you have in your release form. It won't matter in the end. It's all going to be intent and negligence. And so I said, well, okay, I'll get rid of the release form. There's no point, because the person I'm doing it on obviously wants it done. And all the witnesses around understand that the person wants it done. And so, yeah, it's a given. It's a given risk, but so far it's not been an issue.
In addition to RFID tags, you've previously sold the M31 magnet implant, meant for sensory augmentation, and the M36 magnet, meant for lifting. However, these magnets have been back-ordered for quite a while now, and your website says that you are redesigning the manufacturing process due to various quality issues with the previous process. What were those issues, and what's the plan for magnets moving forward?
Yeah, so I put a lot of effort into making sure that the products produced are are safe. And I typically will put the prototypes in myself first. And so I had the first N31 magnet ever produced, put into my pinky finger. I still have the version 1 Yuki device in my arm. That's hopefully going to be replaced here pretty soon. But what happened with magnets was it was a partnership arrangement between myself in Dangerous Things and two other guys that formed a group called Science for the Masses. And they came to me and they said, hey, we think we can do this. We need money. And I was like, okay, let's go over the plan. What are you doing? Why do you think it'll work? Blah, blah, blah. So after getting some prototypes, put one on my finger, seemed to be great. We produced, I think, several thousand of them at quite a high cost. And we basically worked through the prototyping process together. And then they were essentially in charge of production. Like, I didn't want to take on all the minutia of doing that. And my opinion was they had done a great job producing the prototypes. So yeah, I'll just give them that responsibility. We'll set it up like they're a OEM and I'm just buying their product, right? So we did that. I basically funded all the development, and I had an exclusivity deal with them where they would just sell to me, and they would just kind of be like my factory. So we did all that and started selling them, and it was great. And then we started, I think probably close to 9 or 10 months later, after mass production, we started getting some reports from people that were saying, hey, we had a problem with the magnet breaking down or like losing strength, and we had to have it removed. So we started getting feedback where it's like, okay, these magnets aren't holding up, something's going on. And so then I pulled the magnets from the store and I started looking at all the inventory that I had and like really doing some serious testing on them, getting scanning electron microscope, radiographs done, like everything, and realized there were some consistency issues, and the testing procedures that Science for the Masses had done were not sufficient. And so I started testing all the remaining inventory, ripping apart products, putting it through the test process, and started, trying to do accelerated testing. I didn't want to emulate the body because that was taking 9 months. I wanted to really force the issue on these magnets. And so I developed a test procedure that essentially would show if there was any issue in only a few days. And turns out that pretty much all of them had issues of varying degrees, but ultimately were not saleable. So we tried to work out solutions for quite some time, and then Science for the Masses ended up disbanding. They broke up as a company. So I had to start working on my own on solutions to redesign the manufacturing process, and essentially that kind of became my personal Vietnam. It was just a terrible pit of endless cycles of development. You would do a bunch of magnets and try this thing, and that would cost $5,000 to try that thing, and then, no, that's terrible. And do you want to do 10 more iterations trying that thing, or do you want to try a new thing? And then how many iterations will that take? And so I shudder to think, I have never actually calculated it. I left it up to my accountant because I didn't want to know how much money I had actually spent on magnets in total, but it's a huge amount. I know it's a giant amount. And so, time-wise, it was taking up like 3/4 of my day every day for almost a year. And I was like, no, I can't keep throwing good money after bad, and time and effort. So I kind of put them on the back burner. And creative process is funny, right? So just recently, I'd say probably a month ago, I was like taking a shower, just kind of like a standing zombie, and just thinking about stuff. And then I had this thought about a potential option for magnets that I hadn't thought about in months. And I was like, oh man, that could work. And so I hopped out of the shower, and actually right at this moment, we're waiting for a test batch. So it's pretty exciting, actually.
Yeah, I look forward to those being back up on the store soon, hopefully, if everything goes according to plan. So last question here. You're doing a lot of interesting work with passive implants, meaning implants that do not contain a power source. At this point, the most common power source for implanted devices is a lithium-ion battery, which is not ideal. These are the same types of batteries that keep exploding in Samsung Note 7 phones, and having something like that happen inside of you could be fatal. So I know there's been a lot of work within the community to find alternative methods of powering devices, but so far nothing has panned out. Do you think you'll eventually experiment with powered implants, or are you intentionally avoiding that?
Well, I am intentionally avoiding it now. I actually had joined the ranks of trying to find solutions, and so much so that I actually funded another person to work on some nanotech that would develop essentially a hybrid supercapacitor battery. And he made some progress on it, but at the moment he's off doing other things. So it has stalled at the moment. So but battery technology it's a known problem, and there's tons of people working on new ideas and new things. And I'm confident that at some point we're going to come across a battery technology or an energy storage technology that's going to be probably designed for some other industry, but is applicable to consumer grade implantable powered devices. And that's the thing. It's like there's a huge difference, and people don't understand. Well, what about a pacemaker or medical devices with batteries? And that is true. There are batteries in medical devices, but those medical devices cost, 30 grand. And there's a reason, and it's not a consumer device. It's not, $100 device. And the difference is you can have something that's designed, perfectly well, designed with the same quality standards as a medical device, but your production and your materials and your quality analysis through the entire process, from every component to every circuit board to every battery, it's not going to be the same. It can't be, because once it is, that device no longer costs $100. It costs, $30,000 or whatever it costs. So it's just a matter of being able to get a battery or energy storage technology that is capable of handling a failure that's impossible for a consumer grade device to predict. And so what I mean by that is it's got to be able to not off gas if it's overcharged or shorted. It's got to be able to, these are just normal failures of electronics, not, physical failures like being pierced or something. But, it's got to be able to handle all of these things where maybe your circuit's designed perfectly and it works great. And then you got a resistor from a bad batch that stays in spec for 6 months and then goes wildly out of spec. And now all of a sudden your battery's overcharging. And, something like that can and does happen quite a bit. And the battery itself, the method of storage, needs to be able to take that in stride, not produce off-gassing, not produce a pressure pocket in the hermetically sealed device, not thermally overrun, don't start a heat chain reaction that then results in an explosion. There's so many things that in a consumer good device like a wearable or a Fitbit or a vape pen that explodes or a hoverboard that catches fire or a Samsung Note that blows up, those are terrifying events. But even your everyday devices, there will be battery malfunctions that don't result in these catastrophic failures, but result in pressurization of the battery, so off-gassing happens. But in the user environment, the normal thing that Samsung Note 7 is not airtight. The gas escapes, and maybe it was a one-time event or whatever, but it's not going to result in terrible things happening. But maybe your battery, your phone doesn't last as long, or maybe the battery needs replacing or something. But in an implant device where you have completely different environment, it's warmer because it's in your body, it's sealed, so there's absolute airtight container where any amount of off-gassing from the battery is going to create a huge problem inside that implant. There's just fundamentally different requirements. So until we have a battery technology that can handle all those things and still keep you safe, consumer grade powered electronics are going to be a tough one.
So it sounds like you have a lot of exciting things in the works, especially with VivoKey. For anyone who wants to follow along with your work and keep updated on things as they happen, where would you suggest they go to do that?
You can go to VivoKey.com, or there's Facebook pages, of course. You can join those, and we're going to be opening forums as well, and then of course DangerousThings.com and the user forums there, and but yeah, Facebook pages and groups, and then the forums. Those are the two biggest places.
Well, I will put links to your social media accounts and your websites in the show notes at futuregrind.org. And thanks again for joining me on the podcast.
Sure, no problem.
Hey everyone, Ryan O'Shea again, and thanks for listening to my interview with Amal Graafstra. Remember to check out the show notes and more at futuregrind.org. Make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and you can also like, comment, and share to spread the word. We wanted to send one more thank you to our sponsors at Kunstwerk Multimedia. Kunstwerk is an immersive science fiction project from R. Nicholas Starr that explores a cyberpunk future through music, visual, and industrial arts. The project features distinct soundtracks telling the story of 4 different characters, featuring everything from the sounds of medieval Europe to science fiction-inspired electronic dance music. You can find out more about this synthesis of the arts at kunstwerkmultimedia.com, and we'll leave you with a sample of their track titled Transhuman. Till next time, this is Future Grind.